The town of Cibecue had 3 days of firewood left when the second storm hit. Not the settlement's total supply. The individual households varied, some better stocked than others. But the communal woodpile behind the trading post that the town relied on for the schoolhouse stove and the boarding house, and the 2 families on the north end who had arrived late in the season and had not finished their own cutting before the first storm locked the timber roads. 3 days of communal wood against a sky that every man in Cibecue who had spent more than 2 winters on the Mogollon Rim recognized as carrying 5 more days of weather at minimum. Cibecue's problem was specific and structural. The settlement sat in a narrow canyon drainage below the rim's edge, where the timber was accessible in good weather and inaccessible in bad. The single road to the Ponderosa stands, climbing a switchback grade that became impassable under 6 inches of snow and currently had 14 inches on it with more falling. The town had wood enough to survive a 3-day storm. It was facing a 5-day storm minimum and possibly longer. The arithmetic was not complicated, and everyone in Cibecue understood it, and nobody had a solution except the man they had been quietly mocking since September. His name was Fetch Doran. He was 52 years old, a former Army surveyor who had mustered out of Fort Apache in 1882 and had filed on a small claim at the canyon's upper end, where the rim wall curved inward and created a natural alcove in the sandstone face large enough to stable 2 horses and store a significant quantity of cut timber out of the weather. Fetch had spent the summer of 1887 doing something that the Cibecue settlers had watched with the specific puzzlement that communities reserve for behavior they cannot categorize. He had been enlarging a cave. Not the horse alcove, a second formation 30 yards further along the rim wall, a deeper horizontal split in the sandstone that ran back into the cliff face at a slight upward angle, creating a natural drainage that kept the interior dry, regardless of surface weather. The opening was 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, narrowing to 4 feet at the back where the sandstone plates compressed together. Fetch had spent 4 months removing the loose rock debris from the interior floor, building a dry stone retaining wall across the opening's lower half to contain cold air drainage, cutting and hauling ponderosa pine in 4-foot sections that he stacked inside the cave in tight cords against both side walls. The Cibecue settlers had opinions about this. Roy Bassett at the trading post had said, a man who spent his summer hauling firewood into a hole in a cliff instead of building a proper woodshed, was a man who had left too much of himself at Fort Apache. The Gruder brothers, who ran cattle on the East Bench, had ridden by the cave in August and counted the stacked cord wood and calculated aloud to each other and within Fetch's hearing that he had cut enough wood for 3 winters on a claim that 1 man occupied, and that the only reasonable explanation was that he had lost his ability to estimate things correctly. The schoolteacher, Mrs. Beaumont, had said nothing directly, but had told her husband that a man living half in a cave was not the kind of neighbor a growing settlement needed to encourage. Fetch had heard all of it and had kept cutting. His reasoning was not complicated, and he had explained it once to Roy Bassett in September when Bassett had asked him directly what he was doing and why. He had said the Mogollon Rim created its own weather patterns that the standard Arizona Territory winter predictions did not account for, that the canyon orientation funneled north winds in a way that compounded storm duration and intensity beyond what the open plateau experienced, and that a settlement with 1 access road on a switchback grade had a single point of failure that would eventually produce a multi-day isolation event that the town's current wood supply was not sized to handle. Bassett had nodded and said he had been in Cibecue for 6 years without that happening. Fetch had said 6 years was not a long enough sample. He had gone back to cutting wood. By the time the first storm arrived in November, Fetch had 14 cords of split ponderosa pine stacked inside the cave in tight rows that ran from floor to ceiling on both side walls, leaving a central corridor 4 feet wide that ran the cave's full depth. The wood was dry, cut in July and August, stacked in a space that the sandstone walls kept at a consistent temperature regardless of outside conditions, protected from precipitation by the natural overhang above the opening and the dry stone wall across the lower entrance that deflected ground moisture away from the base of the stacks. He had also done something else that nobody in Cibecue had noticed, because nobody had looked closely enough. He had built a fire pit inside the cave. Not at the entrance where the draft would carry smoke outward. At the rear of the cave, where the slight upward angle of the ceiling created a natural flue effect, drawing combustion gases up along the rock face and out through a crack in the sandstone above that Fetch had identified in June by holding a candle at the cave's back wall and watching which way the flame leaned. The crack was not large. It was large enough. He had tested the draft in August with a small fire and had confirmed that the cave vented cleanly at a burn rate sufficient to heat the full interior volume to 50 degrees above outside ambient within 90 minutes. He had told nobody about this either. On the morning of December 9th, when the second storm hit Cibecue and Roy Bassett came out of the trading post and looked at the communal woodpile and then looked up the canyon toward the rim wall, where Fetch Doran's cave sat behind its dry stone retaining wall, with 14 cords of split ponderosa inside it. Bassett stood in the snow for a long moment, doing arithmetic he had declined to do in September. Then he walked up the canyon. Bassett came up the canyon with his hat pulled low and his coat collar turned against the horizontal snow and his boots punching through the crust with every step in the way that told a man the drift was deeper than it looked, and getting deeper. Fetch saw him coming from the cave entrance where he was splitting kindling on the dry stone wall's flat capstone, the hatchet going in short, economical strokes that produced finger-width pieces he stacked in a wooden box beside the fire pit. He did not stop splitting when Bassett came through the entrance gap. He finished the piece on the wall and set the hatchet down and looked at Bassett and waited. Bassett said the communal woodpile had 3 days left. He said the second storm was running harder than the first and showed no sign of breaking before day 5 at minimum. He said the Gruder family on the east bench had sent their youngest boy into town that morning to say their own supply was down to 4 days and the road to their timber stand was buried past any horse's ability to navigate it. He said Mrs. Beaumont's husband had burned a chair the previous evening because the wood box was empty and the schoolhouse needed the stove running for the children, who came in from the outlying claims each morning. He said all of this standing inside the cave entrance, looking at the 14 cords of split ponderosa stacked floor to ceiling on both walls, with the central corridor running back into the firelit dark. And his voice had the specific flatness of a man delivering information he wishes he did not need to deliver. Fetch listened to all of it without expression. Then he asked Bassett how many people were in Cibecue counting outlying claim families. Bassett said 41 people across 11 households, if you counted the Gruders and the 2 Rim families, who brought their children to the schoolhouse each morning. Fetch looked at the wood stacks for a moment, doing the arithmetic of 41 people against 14 cords of split ponderosa at the consumption rate a cave fire of this size produced. He had been running the cave fire for 2 days at a moderate burn that maintained the interior at 52 degrees and had consumed less than 1/3 of a cord. The cave's thermal mass, the sandstone walls that had been absorbing heat since he lit the first fire in November, was now contributing its own stored warmth back into the air, reducing the fuel requirement below his original calculation. 14 cords at current burn rate would last considerably longer than his September estimates had suggested. He told Bassett to bring everyone up. Bassett said he was not sure everyone would come. He said some of the settlers had expressed reservations about the cave's structural safety when Fetch had been building the retaining wall in September. And those reservations had not been formally retracted. Fetch picked up the hatchet and went back to splitting kindling. He said the reservations were welcome to freeze alongside their owners, or they were welcome to come up the canyon. He said the cave did not require anyone's prior approval to be warm, and he was not going to ask for it retroactively. He said Bassett should tell the families with children first, because children were not responsible for their parents' opinions, and the temperature outside was heading toward -10 by nightfall. Bassett went back down the canyon. The first family arrived within the hour. The Kellerman family, 6 people, including a grandmother of 70, who had to be helped through the entrance gap by her son-in-law, and who stood in the cave's central corridor looking at the fire pit and the stacked wood and the sandstone walls, radiating stored heat, and said something in German that her son-in-law did not translate, but that sounded like a complete revision of a previously held position. The Beaumonts came next. Then the 2 Rim families, who had the furthest to travel and arrived in the early afternoon with frost on their coat collars, and children who went directly to the fire pit without being directed, and sat down on the flat stones Fetch had arranged around it in September for exactly this function. Fetch had arranged those stones in September. That detail moved through the cave over the course of the afternoon as more families arrived and looked at the fire pit surround and the ventilation crack above it, and the dry stone retaining wall, and the cord wood stacked with the precision of a man who had been planning a specific use for a specific space for a specific duration. And the detail did what details do when they arrive late. It reorganized the understanding of everything that had come before it. Roy Bassett arrived last, after dark, having spent the afternoon managing the settlement's transition and making sure every household had been reached. He came through the entrance gap and stood in the firelight and looked at the 41 people filling the cave's central corridor and the spaces between the wood stacks and the flat stone surround around the fire pit. And he looked at the temperature differential between the cave interior and the outside air that was visible as a wall of condensation at the entrance gap where the 2 air masses met. He pulled his hat off. He said he owed Fetch an apology for what he had said at the trading post in September. Fetch was feeding a 4-foot ponderosa split into the fire pit with the iron hook he used to manage large pieces without burning his hands. He set the piece in place and adjusted it with the hook and did not look up. He said the apology was noted. He said there was cornmeal in the canvas sack against the east wall, and Bassett was welcome to start a pot, because 41 people were going to be hungry before morning, and the cooking fire was the same fire that heated the cave, and it was already burning, and it would be a waste not to use it. Bassett found the cornmeal and started the pot. Outside, the second storm delivered its full weight against the Mogollon Rim and the canyon below it, with the impersonal force of weather that does not know or care what is in its path. Inside the cave, the sandstone walls held their heat, and the ponderosa burned slow and clean, and the ventilation crack above the fire pit pulled the smoke up and out through the rock face in a thin gray thread that disappeared into the blizzard above. The fire did not go out that night. It did not go out the night after that either. The third day was the hardest, not because the storm worsened. It held at the same sustained intensity it had delivered since day 1. the canyon filling with wind-driven snow that packed against the dry stone retaining wall and built a drift across the lower entrance that Fetch cleared twice daily with a flat-bladed shovel he kept propped against the right wall for exactly this purpose. The third day was hardest because 41 people in a sandstone cave on day 3 had exhausted the novelty of the situation and arrived at the reality of it, which was less interesting and more difficult than the novelty had been. The children managed better than the adults. They had claimed the flat stones around the fire pit as their territory on the first evening and had not relinquished them, sleeping in a ring around the fire with their coats pulled over them and their feet pointed inward toward the heat, the way spokes point toward. The hub. They ate the cornmeal Bassett cooked, and they slept, and they woke, and they were warm. And for children, that was a sufficient accounting of the situation. The adults were doing the accounting differently. Ole Gruder, whose cattle operation on the East Bench was the settlement's largest, had arrived on day 2 with the specific expression of a man who has said things publicly that the current situation is in the process of proving wrong, and he had maintained that expression through day 3 while sitting against the east wood stack with his arms crossed and his eyes on the fire pit. He had not spoken to Fetch directly. He had spoken around him, questions directed at Bassett, observations made to his brother Carl, comments about the cave's dimensions, and ventilation addressed to the middle distance. Fetch had not responded to any of it because none of it was addressed to him, and he had work to do. The work on day 3 was water. 41 people through 3 days had consumed the water Fetch had stored in 4 sealed barrels against the cave's back wall faster than his original single-occupant calculation had projected, which was not a failure of planning, but a straightforward consequence of scaling. He had approximately 1 barrel remaining, enough for 2 days at careful rationing. The solution was snow, which existed in unlimited quantity outside the entrance, and the fire pit, which could melt it. The constraint was containers. He had 4 barrels and 4 cooking pots, and the combined melt capacity of those vessels running continuously on the fire pit could produce enough water for 41 people through the remaining storm duration if someone managed the process without interruption. Fetch organized it the way he organized everything, by function, without asking for volunteers, simply assigning the task to the person nearest the relevant equipment. He handed the largest cooking pot to Carl Gruder, who was sitting closest to the entrance, and told him to fill it with clean snow from above the drift line where the surface was uncontaminated by foot traffic, and to keep it filled on the fire, and to pour the melt into the barrel when the pot was full, and to repeat this process without stopping until Fetch told him to stop. Carl Gruder looked at the pot, and then at his brother Ole, and then took the pot, and went to the entrance and started filling it with snow. Ole watched this happen, and said nothing. By the evening of day 3, the water problem was resolved, and would stay resolved as long as Carl kept the rotation running, which he did with a reliability that Fetch noted without commenting on. The cave's internal temperature had climbed above the day 1 reading as the accumulated body heat of 41 people added to the fire pit and the sandstone thermal mass. Fetch estimated 61 degrees by the 3rd evening, warmer than the average Cibecue cabin in good weather with a functioning stove. The storm broke on the morning of day 5. Fetch knew it was breaking before anyone else in the cave registered the change, not from the sound, which shifted from a sustained roar to an intermittent gust, but from the ventilation crack above the fire pit. For 4 days, the crack had been pulling smoke upward in a steady, unbroken column, the consistent draw of a system under sustained pressure differential. On the morning of day 5, the column began to waver. the smoke pulling sideways briefly before resuming its vertical path, which meant the wind above the rim had shifted direction and the storm's organized pressure system was losing its coherence. He added a full split to the fire and let it burn up, and said nothing. By mid-morning, the wavering had become intermittent, and the snow at the entrance had stopped accumulating on the dry stone wall's capstone, and the quality of light coming through the entrance gap had changed from the flat gray of storm light to something sharper and more directional that meant the overcast was thinning above the canyon. Ole Gruder stood up from his position against the east wood stack and walked to the entrance and looked out at the canyon, and stood there for a long time without speaking. Then he turned around and looked at Fetch across the central corridor, with the fire pit between them and the remaining 12.5 cords of split ponderosa stacked on both sides, and 41 people beginning to move and talk with the specific energy of people who have been still for 4 days and can feel the stillness ending. He said he had cut enough timber for 1 winter in the 6 years he had been running cattle on the East Bench. He said he had been wrong about that. He said he intended to cut for 3 winters, starting in the spring, and he would like to know where Fetch thought the best additional storage location was on the East Bench, given the drainage patterns and the prevailing wind direction. Fetch looked at him across the fire. He said the East Bench had 2 sandstone outcroppings on its north face that he had surveyed in 1883 during his last season at Fort Apache. He said the northern outcropping had a horizontal split that ran 16 feet back into the cliff at a consistent 4-degree upward angle that would drain clean in any precipitation event, and that the opening faced southeast, which meant it caught morning sun and stayed dry even in extended wet weather. He said he would ride out with Ole in the spring and show him. Ole nodded once and went back to his position against the east wood stack and sat down and did not say anything further. And neither did Fetch, because the conversation was finished, and there was nothing useful to add to a finished conversation. The families began leaving the cave through the afternoon as the canyon road became passable on foot and then on horseback. They left in the order their claims required: outlying families first, settlement families last, the Beaumonts departing mid-afternoon with their 4 children, and the grandmother who had arrived saying something in German and left without saying anything at all, but who pressed Fetch's hand at the entrance gap with both of hers and held it for 3 seconds before her son-in-law helped her through. Bassett left last. He stood at the entrance and looked back at the cave, the fire pit with its banked coals, the wood stacks reduced by 1.5 cords across 5 days for 41 people, the flat stone surround with its ring of abandoned cornmeal pots, the ventilation crack above, pulling the last of the smoke upward through the sandstone. He said it had worked better than he had any right to expect, given that he had not believed in it. Fetch said it had worked exactly as well as he had calculated it would work, which was not better or worse than expected, but precisely on the number, and that if Bassett wanted to update his expectations for the next event, he was welcome to look at the survey notes from 1883 that Fetch kept in the canvas sack against the back wall, because the notes contained assessments of 4 other canyon formations within 3 miles of Cibecue that had similar thermal properties to the cave they were standing in, and the settlement might consider whether any of them were worth developing before the next 5-day storm made the question urgent. Bassett looked at the canvas sack. He asked if he could borrow the notes. Fetch said he could keep them. He had the numbers in his head.